Sarah Thompson, a resilient black teenager trapped in a life of domestic servitude under her adoptive parents, Laura and Mark Thompson. While the Thompsons maintain a polished, high-status image, they systematically strip Sarah of her humanity, starving her and denying her an education to keep her as their hidden slave. During a brutal winter storm, Sarah is forced out on a dangerous errand and collapses in the snow, only to be rescued by Kang Min-soo, a formidable Korean mafia boss. Min-soo soon discovers a world-shattering truth. Sarah is his biological daughter, the child of the only woman he ever loved. As Min-soo launches a calculated campaign to dismantle the Thompsons' lives piece by piece, Sarah must shed her burden identity. Hello, family. Welcome to Afro Soul Mafia Stories. Before we proceed to the story of how a hidden slave became a mafia princess, I would love to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comments section and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's continue with the story. The black SUV didn't just stop. It occupied the space at the corner of the suburban street with the silent, heavy authority of a predator. Inside the vehicle, the air was climate-controlled to a perfect, sterile coolness, but Kang Min-soo felt a strange, inexplicable pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the atmosphere. He had been in the city for less than 24 hours to oversee the quiet acquisition of a local shipping firm, yet his instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive through 2 decades of syndicate warfare, were screaming. He stared through the tinted glass, his sharp, angular face reflected in the dark surface, his piercing eyes tracking the swirling chaos of the blizzard. At first, he thought the shape in the distance was a discarded pile of refuse, something common in a neighborhood that looked polished on the surface but felt hollow underneath. But then, a flash of dark skin against the blinding white snow caught his eye. It was a hand, small and delicate, reaching out before curling into the frozen drift. "Stop the car," Min-soo commanded. His voice was a low, resonant growl that brooked no argument. His driver, a man who had seen Min-soo order the disappearance of rivals without blinking, looked surprised but obeyed instantly. Min-soo stepped out into the storm. His tailored black wool coat, costing more than the cars parked in the driveways of these suburban homes, immediately caught the white flakes. He didn't feel the cold. His gaze was locked on the girl. As he approached, the scene became a horror of contrast. Her thick, voluminous, natural curls were matted with ice, and her thin gray coat was so tattered it offered no more protection than a shroud. He knelt beside her, his movements graceful and controlled despite the howling wind. Up close, Sarah's face was a portrait of exhaustion, sadness, and vulnerability. Her dark brown skin was pale at the edges, and her breath was coming in shallow, ragged hitches. To the world, and certainly to the Thompsons watching from behind their warm curtains, she was a nuisance, a slave to be discarded when the work was done. To Min-soo, she was a human being dying in the shadow of luxury. "Wake up," he murmured, his stern expression flickering with an unfamiliar concern. He reached out to check for a pulse, his gloved hand brushing against a cold metallic object hanging from her neck. It was a locket, cheap and scratched, held together by a frayed string. As he shifted her weight to lift her, the locket popped open. Min-soo froze. The world around him, the wind, the snow, the distant hum of the city, fell into a deafening silence. Inside the locket was a photograph, faded by time but preserved with obsessive care. It was a picture of a woman he had spent 13 years trying to find. Aaliyah. She was laughing, her eyes bright with the same soft yet expressive quality he now saw in the unconscious girl's face. Next to her in the photo was a younger version of himself, wearing a high school blazer, his arm draped around her with a possessiveness that had been his undoing. His heart, which he had long ago armored in ice, shattered. He looked from the photo to Sarah. The delicate features and the natural beauty that shone through her suffering weren't just a coincidence. She was the living image of the only woman who had ever looked past the monster he was becoming to see the man he could have been. "Aaliyah," he whispered, the name a jagged prayer. He realized then that the girl wasn't just a victim of the storm, she was his blood. She was the daughter he never knew existed, the secret Aaliyah had kept to protect her from the very world Min-soo ruled. His protective instincts, usually reserved for his empire, flared into something lethal. He looked up at the Thompson house, his eyes turning into cold obsidian. He could see the golden glow of their dinner through the window, a cruel taunt to the girl they had left to die. They had treated his daughter like a burden, a glitch in their perfect lives. Minsu didn't call for an ambulance. He didn't trust the world to care for her. He gathered Sarah into his arms, her slim, delicate frame trembling against his chest. She felt as light as a broken bird. He carried her back to the SUV, his posture upright and commanding, his black silk shirt visible beneath his coat as he shielded her from the wind. "Go," he told the driver as he climbed into the back, pulling Sarah into the warmth of the leather seat. "To the penthouse. Call Dr. Han. Tell him if he isn't there in 10 minutes, I'll find a new doctor and a new place for his family to live." As the vehicle sped away from the Thompson estate, Minsu held Sarah's frozen hands in his. He didn't care about the shipping firm or the syndicate's bottom line anymore. He looked at the girl, his daughter, and saw the scars of her neglect, the ragged and stained clothes that spoke of 1,000 daily humiliations. "You are no longer alone, Sarah," he rumbled, his voice thick with a promise of retribution. "They gave you the cold, I will give them the fire." He closed the locket, but he didn't put it back around her neck. He tucked it into his breast pocket, right against his heart. The dragon of soul had found his hidden cub, and the world was about to learn what happened when you tried to extinguish the light of a mafia boss's daughter. The transition from the lethal, white silence of the blizzard to the sanctuary of the penthouse was a blur of motion that Sarah only experienced in fractured, feverish snatches. She remembered the hum of a powerful engine, the scent of expensive sandalwood and leather, and the feeling of being held by someone whose arms were as unyielding as iron but surprisingly careful. When she finally drifted into a deeper consciousness, the first thing she noticed was the absence of pain. For the first time in years, the biting hunger in her stomach had been replaced by a dull, manageable ache, and the persistent chill that had lived in her bones since the Thompsons took her in was gone. Sarah opened her eyes slowly, her soft yet expressive face turning toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a city draped in a shimmering veil of snow. She was tucked into a bed that felt like a cloud, beneath silk sheets that were a far cry from the thin, moth-eaten blankets of the Collins pantry. The room was a masterpiece of dark luxury, filled with the quiet hum of a high-end climate control system. For a moment, she panicked, her voluminous natural curls spilling across the pillow as she tried to sit up, her heart racing with the conditioned fear that she was late for her chores. She expected to hear Laura's sharp, cold and calculating voice demanding she scrub the floors, or feel Mark's stern and unapproachable presence looming over her. "Stay down, Sarah," a low, commanding voice rumbled from the shadows of the room. She froze. Kang Min-soo was sitting in a velvet armchair near the window, his tall, strong, and commanding presence filling the space even while he remained still. He had removed his heavy wool coat, revealing a formal black shirt that fit perfectly over his broad shoulders. His sharp, angular face was illuminated by the soft amber glow of a desk lamp, and his piercing dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her catch her breath. He rose and walked toward the bed. Sarah flinched instinctively, pulling the silk covers to her chin, her eyes wide with exhaustion and vulnerability. She was used to men like Mark Thompson, who used their physicality to dominate and control. But as Min-soo reached the bedside, his facial expression shifted to show concern and care. He didn't tower over her. Instead, he sat on the edge of the mattress, his posture upright, but his movements gentle and caring. "You are safe here," he said, his voice dropping to a register of surprising warmth. He reached out, and for a terrifying second, Sarah thought he might strike her. Instead, his large, calloused hand settled lightly on her forehead, checking her temperature with a tenderness that seemed entirely at odds with the polished appearance of a mafia boss. "The fever is breaking. Dr. Han said you were suffering from severe malnutrition and stage 1 hypothermia. He said you haven't had a real meal in days." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat feeling tight. I didn't finish the laundry. Ma'am said I couldn't eat until the silk was pressed." Min-soo's jaw tightened, his strong jawline becoming a hard, dangerous edge. For a fleeting moment, the stern and authoritative mask of the chairman returned, his eyes flashing with a cold fire that promised a war was coming. But when he looked back at Sarah, he forced the rage back down. He picked up a small porcelain bowl from the nightstand, the steam rising from it carrying the savory, healing scent of abalone porridge. "You will never worry about laundry or meals again," he promised, his intense gaze locking onto hers. He dipped a silver spoon into the bowl and held it out to her. It was a gentle gesture that felt like a revolution to Sarah, a man of such wealth, power, and control, taking the time to feed a girl who had been told she was a nuisance and a burden her whole life. Sarah hesitated, then leaned forward, taking the first bite. The warmth of the food spread through her, bringing tears to her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice cracking with sadness and a spark of hope. "You don't even know me." Minsu reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, the metal gleaming in the soft light. He opened it, revealing the photo of Aaliyah. "I knew your mother, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with a grief he usually kept immaculate and hidden. "And I have spent 13 years looking for the piece of my heart that she took with her when she left. I didn't know that piece had a name. I didn't know she was being treated like a slave by people who aren't fit to breathe the same air as her." He reached out and brushed a stray curl from her face, his touch softening as he looked at her delicate features. In that moment, the Mafia persona fell away, leaving only a father who had finally found his hidden cub. Sarah looked at the man who was both silk and steel, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a glitch or a burden. She felt seen. "Sleep now," Minsu whispered, his commanding presence providing a shield against the rest of the world. "When you wake up, we will begin the work of making the Thompsons regret the day they ever laid a hand on my daughter." Sarah drifted back toward sleep, the rhythm of her breathing finally steady. She didn't know that while she slept, the dragon of soul would be standing by the window, his upright posture, a promise of the scorched earth retribution that was about to descend on the people who had dared to turn his blood into a slave. The morning sun filtered through the high-performance glass of the penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the minimalist furniture, but the atmosphere remained heavy with a chilling clinical tension. In the center of the living area, a man in a white lab coat stood with his head bowed, holding a digital tablet like a sacred text. Kang Minsu stood by the window, his tall, strong, and commanding presence framed by the sprawling city below. He had not slept. His black hair was neatly styled, as immaculate as ever, but the piercing dark eyes that stared out at the horizon were filled with a terrifying, quiet clarity. He was no longer a man searching. He was a man who had found his target. "The results, Dr. Han," Minsu said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to rattle the very air in the room. The doctor cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he swiped the screen. "It is a 99.9% match, Chairman. There is no room for error. Sarah Thompson is biologically your daughter. The genetic markers are identical to the samples we have on file from Aaliyah." Minsu did not move. He did not celebrate. Instead, his strong jawline tightened until the muscle leapt beneath his skin. The blood debt was no longer a theory, it was a physical reality. For 13 years, he had lived as a ghost, a dragon who burned everything in his path because he felt he had nothing left to protect. Now, in the next room, a girl with soft features and dark brown skin was sleeping in silk sheets, unaware that she was the heir to a global empire, and unaware of the monsters who had tried to extinguish her light. "Leave us," Minsu commanded. As the doctor scurried away, Minsu turned his gaze toward a man standing in the corner, his head of security, a shadow who moved with silent lethality. "Tell me about the Thompsons. I want the truth beneath the polish." The security chief opened a leather-bound file. "Mark and Laura Thompson. To the public, they are the pinnacle of suburban success. Mark is a senior partner at a top-tier firm. Laura is a socialite known for her charitable work with foster agencies. But the reality is much darker, Chairman. They didn't adopt Sarah out of love. They used her. They received state stipends for her care while forcing her into domestic servitude. Neighbors report seeing her shoveling snow in ragged and stained clothes, while their biological children were driven to private schools in luxury SUVs. They systematically stripped her of her education, telling the schools she was homeschooled to hide the fact that she was working as their hidden slave." Minsu's piercing dark eyes turned toward the file, the intensity of his gaze enough to wither the paper. He thought of Sarah's bare feet in the snow, her thin gray coat, and the way she had flinched when he reached out to feed her. Every detail of her suffering was a fresh blade in his heart. The Thompsons hadn't just neglected her. They had tried to break the spark of hope and resilience that was his own blood. They had seen his daughter as a burden, a nuisance to be weaponized and then discarded in a blizzard. "They like their status," Minsu remarked, his voice devoid of emotion, which was always the sign of his peak lethality. They like their tailored suits and their designer dresses. They like the upright posture they maintain while stepping on the necks of the vulnerable. He walked over to a table where a glass of vintage scotch sat untouched. He didn't drink it. He simply watched the amber liquid swirl. Mark Thompson values his authority. Laura values her image. We will start by taking those away. I want Mark's firm to realize he has been embezzling client funds that I will ensure appear in his accounts by noon. I want Laura's charity board to receive high-definition footage of the pantry, where my daughter slept on a floor she was forced to scrub. The Dragon of Soul leaned over the table, his sharp, angular face caught in the light, reflecting a side of him that was usually reserved for his enemies. The surprising warmth he had shown Sarah was gone, replaced by the serious and authoritative persona of a man who was about to start a war. The Thompsons had committed the ultimate sin. They had mistaken a Mafia boss's daughter for a slave. They sent her out into the cold, Minsu whispered, his eyes locking onto a photo of Mark Thompson pinned to the file. So we will give them a winter that never ends. I want them to feel the deep, hollow ache of a stomach that hasn't seen food. I want them to know the ice of being cast out. But first, he paused, his expression softening for a fraction of a second as he heard a small stir from the bedroom. I need to tell my daughter who she really is. I need her to know that the girl in the thin gray coat is dead. The princess of the Kang syndicate has arrived. He straightened his sharp, tailored black wool coat and walked toward Sarah's room. Behind him, his empire was already moving. The blood debt was being called in, and before the sun set, the Thompsons would realize that the nuisance they threw into the snow was the only thing that could have saved them from the dragon's wrath. Mark Thompson sat in his executive office, the mahogany desk gleaming under recessed lighting that whispered of old money and unshakable power. He adjusted his silk tie, his broad, stern face set in its usual mask of rigid control. To the world, Mark was a titan, a man who moved markets and commanded respect with a single nod of his neatly combed, graying hair. He was currently reviewing the quarterly projections for his firm, Thompson and Associates, savoring the feeling of being untouchable. He had forgotten all about the girl he had shoved into the blizzard 48 hours ago. To him, Sarah was a glitch, a minor line item that had finally been erased from his ledger. He didn't realize that by discarding her, he had pulled the pin on a grenade that was currently sitting in the hands of the Dragon of Soul. The first tremor hit at 10:15 a.m. Mark's private line buzzed, a direct line reserved for high-stakes investors. It was the CEO of a major shipping conglomerate, a man who usually treated Mark with a reverence bordering on fear. "Mark," the voice on the other end said, sounding strangely hollow. "I'm pulling out, all of it. My board just received a packet of interesting documents regarding your offshore accounts and some very creative bookkeeping involving a certain foster care trust." Mark's face went pale, his sharp features tightening in confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about. Those accounts are empty, Mark," the CEO interrupted. "And the authorities are already on their way to your office. Good luck." The line went dead. Mark stared at the receiver, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Before he could process the threat, his assistant burst into the office without knocking, her face a mask of panic. "Sir, the internal servers just went down. Every client record has been wiped, and in their place, there's a video playing on every screen in the building. It's of your house. It's of the pantry." Mark pushed past her, his strong build feeling suddenly heavy and clumsy. In the main bullpen, dozens of employees were gathered around the monitors. Mark's heart stopped. On the screens was high-definition security footage he didn't even know existed. It showed Sarah, his hidden slave, huddled on a cold floor, shivering in her thin gray coat, while the audio played a recording of Mark's own voice calling her a burden and a nuisance. The moral outrage in the room was palpable. His employees, people who had looked up to him for decades, were staring at him with a revulsion that felt like physical blows. But the financial guillotine had only just begun to drop. In the penthouse across the city, Kang Min-soo stood by his monitors, watching the live feed of Mark's downfall. His piercing dark eyes showed no mercy. He wore a sharp, tailored black wool coat, even indoors, as if preparing for the funeral of his enemies. With a single flick of his finger, he signaled his lead analyst. "Call in the short cells. I want the Thompson name to be synonymous with bankruptcy by the closing bell." Back at the firm, Mark's phone began to ring incessantly. It was his bank. Mr. Thompson, we've detected massive, unauthorized transfers out of your personal and corporate holdings. Every asset you own is being liquidated to cover a sudden, massive debt call from a creditor named the Kang Syndicate. Mark collapsed into his leather chair, the air of superiority and authority he had carried for years evaporating into a thin mist of terror. He realized then that he wasn't being audited, he was being hunted. The Iron Ghost had found the paper trail of every cent Mark had embezzled from Sarah's inheritance, the money her mother, Aaliyah, had left to ensure she was never a slave. Minsu wasn't just taking the money back, he was charging interest in the form of Mark's soul. By noon, the financial guillotine had severed everything. Mark's credit cards were declined at the very lunch spot where he usually spent more on a bottle of wine than Sarah's clothes had cost in a year. His car, the luxury SUV he used to project power, was being towed from the firm's parking lot as a repossession team moved in. Mark stepped out onto the sidewalk, dazed. The stern and unapproachable man was now a target of public mockery as reporters, tipped off by Minsu's network, swarmed the entrance. He looked up at the sky, the gray clouds promising more snow, and felt a sudden, deep, hollow ache in his chest. For the first time, he was the one without a coat, the one without a home, and the one the world had decided was a nuisance. In the penthouse, Minsu turned away from the screens. The destruction of Mark's business was merely the opening act. He walked toward Sarah's room, his facial expression shifting to one of fatherly concern. He had dismantled an empire in 3 hours, but the real work, the transformation of his daughter, was just beginning. He had called in the blood debt, and Mark Thompson was finally learning that in the world of the Korean Mafia, some debts can only be paid in ruin. While Mark Thompson's world was being incinerated by financial ruin, Laura Thompson remained blissfully cocooned in the artificial warmth of the city's most exclusive country club. She sat at a corner table draped in white linen, her blonde hair styled perfectly into a sleek updo that didn't have a single strand out of place. Dressed in a high-end designer dress that shimmered with the subtle luster of old money, she sipped a mimosa and held court with the city's elite. To the women at the table, Laura was a saint, a tireless advocate for the less fortunate, and a woman of profound grace. Her face was composed into a mask of indifference toward anything that didn't involve her social standing, her sharp features gleaming with the pride of a woman who had successfully built a life on a foundation of lies. "I don't know how you do it, Laura," one of the women sighed, leaning in. "Taking in that foster girl, it must be such a drain on your spirit." Laura let out a soft, practiced laugh, her superficial and forced smile lighting up her face. "It is a cross I bear gladly. Someone has to provide a moral compass for those who have nothing. Though I must admit her attitude has become difficult. She's currently taking some personal time away from the house to reflect." She didn't mention that the personal time was a death sentence in a blizzard. She didn't mention that the girl's difficult attitude was actually the trembling of a starving teenager forced to scrub floors until her knuckles bled. But miles away, in the quiet, high-tech nerve center of the Kang penthouse, Kang Minsu was preparing to tear that mask off. He stood behind a wide mahogany desk, his tall, strong, and commanding presence casting a long shadow over the digital tablets laid out before him. He was wearing a formal black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the corded muscle of his forearms, arms that had built a criminal empire and were now dedicated to a different kind of destruction. His piercing dark eyes were fixed on a red button on his screen. "Status?" Minsu asked, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "The guest list for the charity gala is live, Chairman," his tech specialist replied. "The emails are being sent now. We've bypassed their filters. Every socialite, every donor, and every journalist in Laura's circle is about to get a front row seat to the Thompson household." Minsu gave a single, slow nod. "Leak it." Back at the country club, the air was suddenly pierced by the rhythmic chiming of dozens of smartphones. One by one, the women at Laura's table reached for their devices. Laura, ever the picture of superiority and control, checked hers as well, expecting a notification about a new donation or a social invitation. Instead, her screen turned a blood red before flickering into a video feed. It was a hidden camera recording from 3 nights ago. The footage was grainy but clear, capturing the cold and calculating expression on Laura's face as she stood over Sarah in the kitchen. In the video, Sarah was slumped on the floor, her dark brown skin pale with exhaustion, her ragged and stained clothes, a stark contrast to the designer heels Laura was using to nudge her ribs. "Get up, you useless animal," Laura's voice rang out from every phone in the room, amplified by the stunned silence of the club. "You think you get to eat while my floors are still streaked? You're lucky I don't put you back in the gutter where I found you." The table went silent. The mask of indifference on Laura's face didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She looked up, her blue eyes wide with a terror she had never known, and saw the faces of her friends. The women who had admired her were now looking at her with a visceral, moral outrage. They saw the emotionally detached and neglectful mother for exactly what she was. "Laura," one of the women whispered, her voice trembling with disgust. Is that the girl you were just talking about?" Laura tried to stand, her upright posture failing her as her knees buckled. "It's a deep fake. It's a fabrication. Someone is trying to sabotage me." But the video didn't stop. It transitioned into a series of medical photos. The scars Sarah had endured, the raw skin on her hands from the lie, and the final haunting image of Sarah's thin gray coat abandoned in the snowbank. Then, the kicker. A bank statement showing that Laura had been funneling Sarah's state care funds into her own designer accessory account. The social exile was instantaneous and absolute. One by one, the women stood up and walked away, not saying a word. The club's manager, a man who had bowed to Laura for years, approached the table with a face like stone. "Mrs. Thompson, your membership has been revoked, effective immediately. We've already contacted the authorities regarding the misappropriation of foster funds. Please leave before security escorts you out." Laura stood in the center of the room, her sleek, polished updo coming undone as she began to shake. She was no longer the queen of the social circle. She was a pariah. She was the monster under the bed that everyone now knew by name. In the penthouse, Minsu watched the feet of Laura stumbling out of the club, her fashionable outfit now looking like a shroud. He felt no triumph, only a cold, focused satisfaction. He had taken her image. He had taken her status. He had left her with nothing but the reality of her own cruelty. He walked away from the monitors and entered Sarah's room. She was sitting up in bed, her soft yet expressive face looking much healthier, though her eyes still held the hint of sadness from a lifetime of abuse. Minsu sat beside her, his facial expression softening in a way he only allowed for her. "The people who hurt you can never touch you again, Sarah," he said, his voice a gentle and caring promise. "They are being forgotten by the world they loved so much. From now on, you are the only one who matters." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time, her expression transformed into one of confidence. She was no longer the hidden slave of the Thompsons. She was the daughter of the dragon, and while her adoptive mother was being cast into the social cold, Sarah was finally stepping into the light of a father who would burn the world to keep her warm. The penthouse was silent, save for the faint hum of the city's life pulsing thousands of feet below. Sarah sat on a plush velvet sofa, her delicate features illuminated by the soft morning light. She was no longer wearing the ragged and stained clothes of her past life. Instead, she was draped in a robe of heavy, dark silk that felt like a second skin. Her thick, voluminous natural curls had been washed and treated, now bouncing with a vitality they hadn't possessed in years. She looked like a different person, yet her soft yet expressive face still carried the shadows of the Thompson household. The learned helplessness of a girl who had been told she was a burden and a glitch for as long as she could remember. Kang Minsu entered the room, his tall, strong, and commanding presence immediately drawing her eyes. He had shed his sharp, tailored black wool coat, appearing in a simple but impeccably cut black shirt that emphasized his upright posture and intense gaze. He didn't sit across from her as a superior. He sat beside her, his facial expression softening in a way that signaled his protective, fatherly side. "Sarah," he began, his voice a low, resonant vibration of surprising warmth. He held an old, leather-bound book in his lap, a chronicle of the Kang family lineage that stretched back centuries. "For 13 years, you were told your name had no value. You were told you were a slave, but blood does not lie. You are a descendant of kings and warriors. You are a Kang." He opened the book, showing her the intricate calligraphy and photos of ancestors who shared her sharp features and strong jawline. He spoke of the Iron Ghost legacy, not just as a syndicate of power, but as a family that had survived wars, betrayals, and exile by never breaking. He told her about her mother, Aaliyah, and how she had been the only one brave enough to challenge the dragon of soul. "Your mother didn't leave because she didn't love me," Minsu whispered, his piercing dark eyes clouding with a rare moment of vulnerability. "She left because she knew my world was a storm. She wanted you to have peace, but she didn't realize that the world is full of smaller, crueler storms like the Thompsons. She gave you that locket so you would always have a way back to me." Sarah reached up to touch the locket, which now hung on a solid gold chain around her neck. I thought I was just a mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking with sadness and a spark of hope. "Mark used to say that I was lucky they even fed me, that without them I was nothing." Minsu's facial expression shifted to show concern and care, but beneath it, his strong jawline tightened with a lethal promise. "Mark Thompson is a man who builds his height by cutting the legs off others. He is small. You are the daughter of the dragon. You do not wait for permission to exist. You do not scrub floors to earn your place in the sun. You own the sun." He stood up and gestured for her to follow him to a room he had prepared, a private study filled with monitors, books, and a state-of-the-art security terminal. "This is your inheritance, Sarah. Not just the money I took back from the Thompsons, but the knowledge of how to protect yourself. I am going to teach you how to see the shadows before they move. I am going to teach you how to be the iron ghost in your own right." For the next several hours, the Mafia boss became a patient teacher. He didn't teach her how to pull a trigger, not yet. He taught her how to read a room, how to identify an exit, and how to use her soft, expressive face as a mask that hid a mind as sharp as a razor. He showed her how to navigate the complex digital networks of the syndicate, realizing quickly that her natural beauty was matched by a high-functioning, technical intellect that had been suppressed by years of neglect. As the lesson progressed, the exhaustion and vulnerability in Sarah's eyes began to recede, replaced by a hint of hope and resilience. She wasn't just learning about her heritage, she was reclaiming her soul. She realized that being a Kang wasn't about being a criminal, it was about being unshakable. "Why are you teaching me this?" Sarah asked, her expression transforming into one of confidence as she successfully bypassed a security simulation. Minsu leaned back, his commanding presence providing a sense of absolute safety. "Because I cannot always be the shield, Sarah. One day, you will be the one holding the sword. And when that day comes, I want the world to look at you and see the same thing I see, a queen who was once a slave and who will never be a slave again." By the time the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the penthouse, Sarah was no longer the girl in the thin gray coat. She stood by the window next to her father, her posture upright, and her eyes locked on the horizon. She had found her spark of hope, and it was burning with a ferocity that would soon consume anyone who dared to stand in her way. The dragon's lesson was complete, and the hidden cub was finally starting to grow her claws. The moon was a sliver of cold silver hanging over the city, casting long, skeletal shadows across the penthouse. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the quiet stillness that precedes a storm. Sarah lay in her bed, her soft yet expressive face relaxed in a deep, restorative sleep she hadn't known for years. In the next room, Kang Minsu sat at his desk, the polished appearance of a Mafia boss, still intact even in the dead of night. His piercing dark eyes were fixed on a set of blueprints, his upright posture unyielding. He had spent the day teaching Sarah about her heritage, but tonight, his mind was on the Iron Ghost business, specifically, the growing rumblings from the Park Syndicate, a rival group that had been eyeing his territory with hungry, desperate eyes. The silence was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden, jarring flicker of the lights. Minsu was on his feet in an instant, his tall, strong, and commanding presence vibrating with a lethal energy. He reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a sleek, suppressed handgun, his movements confidently upright and precise. He didn't call out. In his world, noise was a luxury for the dead. He moved toward Sarah's room, his intense gaze locking onto the hallway. He knew why they were here. The rumors of a fragile girl being kept in his sanctuary had spread, and the Park Syndicate, thinking they had found a weakness in the dragon's armor, had come to exploit it. In her room, Sarah woke to the sound of a muffled thud, the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor. Her natural curls were wild against the pillow as she sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. For a second, the old fear returned, the exhaustion and vulnerability of the girl who had been kicked into the snow. She expected to see Mark Thompson standing in the doorway with a belt, his stern and unapproachable face twisted in rage. But then she remembered the dragon's lesson. She remembered her father's voice telling her she was unshakable. She didn't scream. Instead, she slid out of bed, her bare feet moving silently across the thick carpet. She reached for the security tablet Minsu had given her, her fingers steady as she accessed the thermal feed. She saw them, 4 heat signatures moving through the foyer, their movements tactical and aggressive. They were armed, their commanding presence intended to intimidate. "Sarah," a low voice rumbled from the doorway. Minsu was there, his angular face a mask of focused stone. He stepped into the room and pulled her behind him, his sharp, tailored silhouette providing an absolute shield. "Stay behind me, don't look." "I see them, father," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking but her eyes locked on the tablet. "They're in the blind spot behind the marble pillars. They think the cameras are looped, but I rerouted the feed this afternoon." Minsu paused, a flicker of surprising warmth, and pride crossing his face even in the heat of the moment. He realized then that the hidden cubby was already starting to hunt. The door to the penthouse exploded inward, the sound of splintering wood and glass echoing through the marble halls. The Park Syndicate's lead hitman stepped through the dust, his broad, stern face twisted in a sneer of triumph. He looked at Minsu, then at Sarah, who was peering over her father's shoulder with an expression of confidence that he hadn't expected. "The dragon has a daughter," the hitman laughed, his voice cold and calculating. "A pretty little thing. A shame we have to break her to get to you." He raised his weapon, but he was too slow. Minsu moved with a lethal speed, his shots finding their marks with clinical precision. The room became a chaos of suppressed fire and breaking glass. The dark luxury of the penthouse suddenly transformed into a war zone. Minsu fought with a posture that exuded control and power, a whirlwind of violence that protected Sarah at every turn. But there were more of them than he had anticipated. 2 more gunmen flanked him, forcing him to dive behind a sofa. Sarah saw the third man, the one Minsu hadn't spotted, creeping toward the back of her father's position, his piercing dark eyes fixed on the kill. "Father left," Sarah shouted, her voluminous natural curls bouncing as she lunged for the security console on the wall. She didn't have a gun, but she had the Iron Ghost network. With a single, decisive command, she triggered the emergency fire suppression system. A blast of thick, white chemical fog filled the room, blinding the attackers instantly. In the confusion, Minsu pivoted, his strong build allowing him to overpower the intruder Sarah had pointed out. The silence that followed was heavy and thick with the scent of cordite and ozone. The attackers lay neutralized on the floor, their commanding presence reduced to nothing. Minsu stood in the center of the room, his black silk shirt torn, his breathing heavy but controlled. He looked at Sarah, who was still standing by the console, her soft yet expressive face flushed with the adrenaline of the fight. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't the girl in the thin gray coat waiting for the world to end. She was the daughter of the dragon, and she had just saved his life. Minsu walked over to her, his facial expression shifting from the coldness of a killer to the concern and care of a father. He reached out and touched her shoulder, his gestures gentle and caring. "You did well, Sarah," he whispered, his piercing dark eyes reflecting a new level of respect. "They thought you were a weakness. They thought they could use you to break me." Sarah looked down at the fallen men, then up at her father. Her expression transformed into one of strength, the past suffering finally being replaced by a sense of belonging. "They were wrong," she said, her voice clear and unyielding. "I'm not a weakness, I'm a Kang." Minsu smiled, a rare, authoritative smile that promised the Park Syndicate would pay for this transgression in blood. He had found his daughter in the snow, but tonight he had found his heir. The midnight ambush had failed, and the world was about to learn that the fragile girl was the most dangerous part of the dragon's empire. The chemical fog from the fire suppression system hung in the air like a ghostly shroud, swirling around the dark luxury of the penthouse as the silence returned, heavier and more dangerous than before. Kang Minsu stood in the center of the wreckage, his sharp, angular face smeared with soot, his piercing dark eyes scanning the haze. He was a predator in his natural habitat, but the primary instinct driving him now wasn't survival. It was the protective, fatherly side, that had taken root the moment he found Sarah in the snow. "Stay behind me, Sarah," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. He checked the magazine of his weapon, his strong build coiled like a spring. But Sarah didn't retreat. She stood at the edge of the master console, her soft yet expressive face set in a mask of grim determination. The exhaustion and vulnerability that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a spark of hope and resilience that had been forged in the fire of the midnight attack. She wasn't looking at the wreckage. She was looking at the shadows. "They aren't all gone, Father," she whispered. Her voice, once a weak broken cloud in the blizzard, was now clear and unyielding. She closed her eyes for a split second, tapping into the intimate knowledge of living in the shadows that the Thompsons had inadvertently gifted her. For years, Sarah had survived by being invisible. She knew how to breathe without making a sound. She knew how to read the subtle shifts in a room's temperature. She knew that the most dangerous monsters didn't growl. They waited. "The vent in the ceiling near the foyer," Sarah directed, her fingers flying across the security tablet. "I heard the metal expand. They're using the ventilation shafts to bypass your men in the lobby." Min-Soo didn't hesitate. He trusted her. He pivoted toward the foyer just as the vent cover clattered to the floor. A final, desperate hitman from the Park Syndicate dropped down, his suppressed rifle raised. But Min-Soo was already moving, his lethal speed allowing him to neutralize the threat before the man could squeeze the trigger. The hitman collapsed, but as he fell, he threw a flashbang grenade toward the center of the room. The world turned into a blinding, white roar. Min-Soo, caught in the center of the blast, stumbled, his upright posture momentarily broken as he clutched at his ringing ears, his vision swimming in a sea of white. Through the ringing, Sarah saw the secondary shadow. A man had slipped through the broken balcony doors, his piercing dark eyes fixed on Min-Soo's back. He raised a serrated blade, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a professional assassin. Min-Soo was vulnerable. The dragon of soul was blind. "No," Sarah screamed. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the Iron Ghost terminal. As the assassin lunged toward her father, Sarah triggered the penthouse's automated security shutters. The heavy, reinforced steel plate slammed down with the force of a guillotine. The assassin, startled by the sudden mechanical roar, flinched, giving Sarah the opening she needed. She grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from a nearby side table and hurled it with every ounce of the growing strength she had found since her rescue. The glass shattered against the assassin's head, the amber liquid spraying across the marble floor. The man stumbled, and in that heartbeat of a second, Min-Soo's vision cleared. The dragon roared. Min-Soo lunged forward, his tall, strong, and commanding presence descending on the assassin like a force of nature. He disarmed the man with a brutal, authoritative efficiency, pinning him to the floor. But he didn't deliver the final blow. He looked up at Sarah, who was standing over the console, her voluminous natural curls wild, her chest heaving with exertion. "He's the last one," she panted, her expression transforming into one of confidence. Min-Soo stood up, his black silk shirt soaked with sweat, his facial expression shifting to show concern and care as he walked toward her. He didn't look at the fallen men, he looked only at his daughter. He realized that the hidden cubby was no longer just a survivor. She was the heir rising. She had used the very trauma of her past, the habit of watching from the corners and anticipating the movements of her abusers, to save the life of the most powerful man in the city. "You saved me, Sarah," Min-Soo whispered, his gestures gentle and caring as he reached out to steady her. "We save each other, Father," she replied, her soft features hardening into a legacy of strength and confidence. Min-Soo nodded, a surprising warmth filling his chest. He looked around at the dark luxury of his penthouse, now a scarred battlefield, and knew that the war with the Park Syndicate was far from over. But as he looked at Sarah, he knew he had already won. The girl the Thompsons had turned into a slave was gone. In her place stood a Kang, and the world was finally going to see what happened when a fragile girl stopped living in the shadows and started commanding them. "The Thompsons think they threw you into the cold to die," Min-Soo said, his upright posture returning with a new, terrifying purpose. "But tonight, you showed me that you are the fire. It's time we finish this." Sarah took his hand, her piercing dark eyes reflecting the same fire as his. The heir rising was ready to claim her throne, and the first order of business was the total, scorched-earth destruction of the people who had dared to treat a queen like a servant. He morning air was a jagged blade of ice, the kind of cold that didn't just nip at the skin, but settled deep into the marrow, much like the night Sarah had been discarded. In front of the Thompson estate, the golden glow of suburban perfection had been replaced by the flashing lights of city marshals and the heavy, rhythmic thud of moving crews. The high-performance glass windows, which had once shielded Laura and Mark from the reality of the world they exploited, were now being shuttered by iron-faced men in black tactical gear. Sleek black SUV idled at the curb, its engine a low, predatory hum. The door opened, and Sarah Thompson stepped out. She was no longer the girl in the thin gray coat with bare feet and frizzed natural curls weighed down by the snow. She wore a sharp, tailored black cashmere coat over a structured silk dress, her thick, voluminous curls styled into a crown of defiance. Her soft yet expressive face was calm, her dark brown skin glowing with a health that had been absent for years. Behind her, Kang Min-soo stepped out, his tall, strong, and commanding presence acting as a permanent shadow of protection. He adjusted his formal black shirt, his piercing dark eyes fixed on the doorway of the house that had been Sarah's prison. The front door of the mansion flew open, but it wasn't Sarah being shoved out this time. It was Laura Thompson. Her blonde hair, usually in a sleek, polished updo, was disheveled, and her high-end designer dress was wrinkled, a far cry from her usual obsession with wealth and maintaining her image. Behind her, Mark Thompson stumbled out, his broad, stern face now pale and crumbling with terror. He clutched a single cardboard box, the only property the Kang syndicate had allowed them to keep. "You can't do this," Laura shrieked, her voice cracking as she saw the marshals hauling her Italian leather sofa toward a liquidation truck. "This is our home. We have rights." "Rights are for those who honor them, Laura," Min-soo's voice rang out, a low, lethal vibration that silenced the street. He walked forward, his upright posture and intense gaze forcing the Thompsons to shrink back. "You treated my daughter like a slave. You stole her inheritance to buy the very shoes you're wearing. Today, the debt is settled in full." Sarah walked past her father, her expression transformed into one of confidence and strength. She stopped directly in front of Mark, the man who had called her a burden and a nuisance. He looked at her, and for the first time, he was the one looking up. He was the one whose legs wobbled and whose breath came in weak, broken clouds. "The locket you tried to throw away," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear, "was the key to the only world you ever cared about. You wanted me to fix my attitude in the cold. Well, Mark, the cold is here." Mark began to sob, a hollow, ugly sound that carried no weight. He dropped the box, spilling its meager contents into the slush. "Please, Sarah, we're your family. You can't leave us with nothing. Where will we go?" Sarah looked at the man who had once loomed over her with crossed arms, projecting authority. She felt the weight of the Cinderella moment, but as she looked at her father, Kang Min-soo, she realized it wasn't a fairy tale anymore. It was the final status swap. She thought of the abalone porridge and the gentle gestures that had restored her soul. "I won't kill you," Sarah said, her dark eyes locking onto Robert, with a finality that was more chilling than the wind. "That would be an end, and I want you to have a beginning. I want you to walk out that gate with exactly what you gave me, nothing but a thin coat and the silence of a world that doesn't know your name." Min-soo signaled his men. With a commanding presence, they escorted the Thompsons to the edge of the property. The gates, once a symbol of their superiority and control, slammed shut with a final metallic boom. Sarah turned her back on the house and the broken people outside the gate. She looked at Min-soo, and the surprising warmth in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. The hidden cub was no longer hiding. She was the daughter of the dragon, and as they climbed back into the SUV, the exhaustion and sadness of her past life finally vanished into the white silence of the snow. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was the heir to an empire, and for the first time in her life, she was going home. The Thompsons learned the hard way that you never mistreat a girl who has a dragon for a father. If you enjoyed this transformation, smash the like button and subscribe for more Afro Soul Mafia stories. Who should the dragon target next? Tell us in the comments. They threw her to the wolves, but she came back leading the pack. See you in the next story.